All right, everyone, welcome back. We have Scott Kirshner, eminent journalist and innovation leader, entrepreneur, who will attempt to lead this panel. An attempt is a good statement for all moderation, I think, even for a moderation coach and preeminent practitioner such as Scott himself. So Scott, I'll leave it all to you. But if it gets too bad, call me in and I'll straighten these people out.
Okay.
We do need to end by 11:30.
Got it. All right. Hey, so Michael explained how the Pigeonhole thing is going to work. So if you're comfortable asking questions through Pigeonhole, do that. It's actually cool because then people can vote up and down questions, and we can make sure the best questions get asked. But if you're scared of the internet and digital interaction, you can just raise your hand, and we can take questions that way too. If you're somehow here in Kendall Square, here at ILP, but you don't own any digital devices, maybe that could be a problem. Maybe you just own an index card, like I do. But anyway, as Trond mentioned, I write a column for the Boston Globe covering startups and venture capital and cool stuff happening in Boston, and then I also edit a website called Innovation Leader that's all about corporate innovation, big companies trying to do cool new stuff. Just to remind you of the cast of characters here, Mark Pacelle from Philips, all the way on your left, the open innovation leader there. Steve Weikal, head of industry relations at MIT's Center for Real Estate, one down. To my left, Emilio Frazzoli from Nutonomy and MIT Lids. And then finally, Ryan Chin, who we just heard of from Optimus Ride. And I guess I just want to ask maybe the first question of Steve, because we haven't heard from him yet. Is, this stuff is really going to have a big impact on cities and the way we build office buildings, the way we build apartments. There's probably a couple hundred parking spaces underground in this building here. As I listen to Ryan, as I listen to Emilio talk, I imagine, well, what do you need that space, that expensive space for? Maybe you just need a little sort of porte-cochere driveway to drop off passengers all day long. But give us a little bit of the big picture of how you guys think when you think about how cities are going to look, residential, commercial, in this new world.
Great. Thanks for having me. I haven't had a chance to introduce myself, but the Center for Real Estate does this kind of research from the real estate standpoint. So this has all been a fascinating conversation through my lens of the built environment. It's already happening in a way between Zipcar in a few years ago, but also Uber and other reasons for us not to own cars. And it's starting to show up in zoning and how buildings get built. Lower parking requirements by cities in certain cases. And this will only continue. So what does that mean? Some cities, anywhere from 40 to 50 to 60% of the city surface is parking, or at least car infrastructure. So what does that mean if we can now drop that? Does that mean we have a bunch of new land to develop? Possibly. Buildings will not have to have as much indoor parking, backdoor parking, on-street parking. So there could be huge, over time, there could be huge implications for this improved optimization of transit and mobility. And we're just talking about maybe residential and office, but there's the whole other aspect is, what if you don't have to build as many gas stations? What happens to that ideal street corner real estate, very valuable street corner real estate? What happens if we have warehousing and shipping? What does it mean to warehousing and shipping? Very exciting to start to envision what that would look like. That whole established global distribution network might change as a result.
So Ryan or Emilio, I guess I'd ask you, in your when you envision the 10, 20-year time frame here, do these vehicles not need a parking space? Are they so well optimized that they just drive all day and there's no spot? They don't need street side parking, garage parking?
Well, it's actually a combination of both, right? So on one hand, the utilization rate will go up. On the other hand, you can actually see it quite easily that if you want to provide good service at during the rush hour, you need to size for that. So it also means that during the rest of the day, a lot of vehicles will actually not be used. But you don't have to park them in like a prime real estate. You don't need to park them downtown. You can go park them somewhere else where where the real estate is not as valuable and people don't care as much about it.
Ryan, you want to chime in?
Yeah, another example, if you look at the bike sharing programs, Paris has over 1,200 stations, 3 times as many metro stations. And it's exactly Emilio's point. If these vehicles are autonomous and you're oversizing, you do need to park them, you need to maintain them, you need to recharge them, and maybe keep them overnight, and you need to have buffer capacity. But that buffer capacity can be centralized as opposed to distributed. So now you can just stick an entire charging station depot with 100 or 200 vehicles underneath the freeway or underneath the highway. I had to change, I was in California last week. But you basically have these depots as opposed to distributed everywhere where there's high land value. So I think that's actually one of the big changes that can happen.
Right. Also, the sizing of the parking lot can be very different, right? Because you don't need to get in and out of the car, right? So you can actually stack them, much more closely together.
Like Tetris.
I want to ask maybe just a couple quick questions, and we'll get to these once we get some more votes here to figure out what are the really good audience questions here. So I'll keep asking some bad questions. But let's talk about regulatory issues, because Ryan, you brought up city, state, there are going to be federal regulations here. We just saw this weekend, Austin seems to have passed city council regulation that made Uber and Lyft so upset that they're pulling out of Austin. And it was, as I understand, there were 2 things that Austin said. One was background checks and fingerprinting if you want to drive for these services, which I guess with autonomous vehicles, maybe it's going to be a check of, how high quality is your code, But the other thing was all about pickup locations, and it was basically just don't double park in active lanes of traffic when you're picking people up. And for some reason, Uber and Lyft didn't like that regulation either. So if you project out, what sorts of things are cities going to be most concerned about in this autonomous vehicle world? Is it purely safety? Is there going to be some threshold of proving that your autonomous vehicle can complete this basic training test to show that you're not going to kill pedestrians or get in accidents?
Okay. Let me answer that, or let me try to answer that. I think that almost everyone is universally concerned with safety. That's whether you're a city, whether you're in the suburbs, whether you're on the highway. Everyone's concerned with that, and that I think is also a major selling point for autonomy, the ability to reduce that. But in fact, a lot of the financial analysis points to safety as only a small benefit compared to the land productivity gains, access, reduction in parking space. All those things are actually higher if you add the economic value. I would say from the city point of view, one of the challenges they're thinking of is how does autonomous vehicles fit within their existing transportation infrastructure, right? Whether it's the TNCs that are there, whether it's taxis, or whether it's their existing mass transportation networks, right? And there is 2 camps on the shared autonomy world. One is that autonomous vehicles will eliminate the need for line transit, and the other is we have autonomous vehicles that connect us to existing mass transit.
Okay, and line transit, camps. You mean like subways, buses, commuter rail,
those things. And my take on this is only personal because others feel the other way, is that we actually should continue to improve line transit because those lines are there, right? All the holes that we have dug for 100 years or more are already here. Let's just continue to improve that, but then bring autonomous vehicles to a kind of combination state.
So Emilio, I assume it's going to be a federal body, but let's envision that today there are Federal Highway Transportation Safety Administration standards for a lot of things, right, that happen with vehicles that are on the road. Is there going to be some kind of standard that your autonomous vehicle has to pass in order to drive in Boston, New York, San Francisco?
I think it's actually an excellent question, and this is actually something that changed earlier this year in January, where the Obama administration announced this program, like a $4 billion program to essentially enable or support these autonomous vehicle technologies. What we have today is that we have like a hodgepodge of like state, local, city regulations, okay? And that's exactly what you don't want, right? So as the provider of this, the service of this technology, what you want to have is some clarity on how this regulation is evolving and whether or not you will be allowed to do business, right? The way that, that you to pursue your vision. And I think it's very important to have this like a federal, program to develop this like a federal level, like a regulation body to support this kind of activity, right? So I think that's a very key point. And getting back to us, the reason why we are doing this in Singapore is because that is exactly, we convince the government that is actually to their benefit. This is critical for the way that they see the future of their country, their city, right? And they're developing with us, all the regulation that will support us to provide what we want to provide.
Yeah. I would like to get to some of these questions, particularly some of the ones that have 5 or more votes. But that's going to be the key threshold for your questions. But I would toss this to you, maybe Steve or you, Mark. What Emilio is talking about is, I think, a key issue for us here in, if you just say we're Kendall Square, MIT, Massachusetts, where is the safe place, where is the area that you can go and test autonomous vehicles? It feels like that's an area or that's a topic that MIT could be pushing on, could be lobbying to say, let's build a testing ground here somewhere in the Boston area.
Are we doing the test work here? I know they're doing it in Ann Arbor. Toyota's doing it in Ann Arbor.
Well, no, I think Emilio and Carl have said, and maybe Ryan, you believe this, that it would be a positive thing, for the Boston ecosystem to let's create a test ground somewhere.
But so this is exactly. There is a test facility that is that people can use here in Massachusetts. However, it's kind of like a it's a closed test facility that is not really that useful today.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that the one out at Devon's?
Devon's, yeah.
So these are still like the proving grounds in the
Right,
old days.
so you just go to some parking lot and drive around, but how useful is that? Now we are, we are past that stage, and now what we are talking about is driving in traffic and with, cities and
real
people,
bicyclists, real pedestrians.
So, and this is one of the reasons why, we're talking about this hodgepodge of regulations. And now here in Massachusetts, we just can't, period. Okay, so we cannot drive an autonomous vehicle, on public roads.
Yeah, and I think one of the key test conditions is going to be when the geese cross Memorial Drive and it stops traffic, like to the autonomous vehicles, can they see a little baby gosling walking across Memorial Drive on a cloudy day?
So I'd like to add to that. I've had lots of conversations, I think Emilio has too, with the DOT and with cities around how to establish Massachusetts as a key testing facility and innovation area for autonomous vehicles. If you look at the other areas, particularly in Mountain View or in Michigan, Michigan has a few more things in common with us. But in Mountain View, you have perfect weather, you have perfect drivers, you have perfect lane markers, you never have snow, and you don't have Massachusetts drivers. And here in Boston, we have urban driving, Massachusetts drivers, right? Snow. Blizzards, just everything
Terrible
possible. other than if you were to take everything that we've done and moved it to India, which would be another place to do testing.
Yeah.
Massachusetts has a unique opportunity to become one of the world leaders in this space. Why are we going to be doing a replica of M-City or what's happening in Mountain View when we can actually have the real environments here? Mm-hmm. This is a leapfrog approach, I would think. But of course, it takes courage to get to that point. I think that's actually where the real opportunity is for this state to really do innovation, is to go beyond that.
All right, well, we have one question that has a whopping 8 votes so far. Several European cities are moving towards car-free cities. Do you have thoughts? I mean, is there going to be I guess I would tag onto this question of car-free cities a thought about, is there a year when we're going to ban non-autonomous driving? Where a human driver would be so unsafe that you just say, we're going to stop issuing driver's license to people. But take the first question first. Thoughts on car-free cities?
Well, from my perspective, I think perhaps it'll get there someday. I think there's so many variables and so many hurdles that the city has to get through. I question even whether something basic as if a city regulates no cars in the city, how does it impact the economics of the city? Are people going to be able to get to the businesses that are there? Mm-hmm. And so, some of the more practical, public transport. You're right. All these new types of transportation, certainly. But I think it's a complex equation that we'll have to think through the implications. I don't have any other insight to help out there.
I have an anecdote. I was in London around Christmas time, and on Sunday in front of Buckingham Palace, there are no cars allowed to drive around. And so if you walk there on that day, people take public transportation. There's plenty of children riding on bicycles. There are people walking on the streets. It's very, very, very nice. And just imagine, I just began to imagine, oh, well, if we got rid of all these stupid cars and we had autonomous vehicles driving very slowly and very carefully and in a very lightweight manner and moving people around, you would have, in addition, because you still need to move people. Some people can't ride a bicycle. Some people can't walk. Some people still need to move deliveries. So you have this sort of multimodal ecosystem where you eliminate the private automobile, but you use that in combination with walking and bicycling and public and mass transit. This is what I discovered when I walked around in that area.
I mean, it's incredible to be in a place like Times Square, which you would have thought you could never ban traffic in Times Square, and it works, pretty nicely as a pedestrian environment.
Well, there is the power of living laboratories, right? So you say, okay, we're going to try this out, see if it works. If it doesn't work, we go back to the old world, right? That's what happened in Times Square with the outdoor furniture, right? So if you treat a city, or at least a portion of the city, as a living lab, and you begin to do some experiments for some period of time, whether it's a month or 2 months or on the weekend or even for a year, people get used to these new ideas. And if it doesn't work, you can always revert back. And I think that's actually one of the processes that you need to go through if you live in a democratic society to do that. Right? Obviously, you can go to some other societies and just say, okay, top down, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah.
This is part of the game. And that's actually what happened with the bike sharing programs. The bike sharing programs actually started that way as an experiment. It worked well, then you scale up, right? And then, of course, you begin to replicate.
So, Brendan, you were skeptical that you even are going to need the autonomous vehicles in some part of
vehicles, full stop.
Okay.
Because what you're doing is you're taking old technology from your friend Mr. Ford, who I think was Irish, by the way, and you're using exactly the same concepts, but making it, using different technology. But it's exactly the same concepts. It just is more cars on the road. So you're putting more cars on the road, or be autonomous cars. Yeah. Now I like your idea because you're not allowing Joe Public to get in the car. It's like a taxi service. Yeah. But even so, it's obviously not going to work everywhere. But if you take a city like London, for example, London's a bit different because it's all over. But I don't know, something like Singapore. Yeah. Well, you could take the downtown area. I don't know, 10 square kilometres or something. Yeah. And you say there's no cars there, and do what they do in Paris. You don't allow delivery vehicles in the city during the day. They have to go between the hours of darkness.
So you're saying just pedestrians, just public transit. That's kind of the best solution for
and new ideas of public transport, not just buses and double-deckers, but new ideas of public transport, where you're not just getting one guy in a car that looks like a smart car.
Yeah.
You're getting 100 people on a tram.
All right. Well, you have to talk to Mike, who asked the question over there, because you guys are simpatico.
Right. I actually think that something that people do not realize is that a limit to the quality of service that can be provided through public transportation is manpower. In many cities worldwide, the government would like to have more buses, right? But they just don't find enough people. This is the case in Singapore. They don't find enough people who are willing to drive the buses. Or if they find them, they need to import them from some other countries and create a lot of social issues, right? So I think that actually this technology that we are developing at this point, we are concentrating on the, say, personal car, right? Like a small car, but because it's cheaper for me to buy a car rather than to buy a bus, right? And it's more convenient, right? But eventually, I think that the ability for the vehicle to move by itself without a driver will actually increase the supply of public transport, right? That's why
you have autonomous public transport systems.
Right, but I think that you have the full spectrum between the convenience, right, to you, right? So, for example, if you live downtown one of these areas, right, where you want only to use public transport, but let's say that you want to go on a date with your girlfriend on Sunday, right? And then you don't want to take the bus and to take her out, right? So maybe you want to have you lease that vehicle for a few hours and. Well, I mean, I think that there is a point for sometimes you need the convenience of a car that is essentially dedicated to you, at least for those hours, right? So I think that there is right. So
talking about driving
right.
Massachusetts or anywhere else. Obviously, you need cars.
Yeah. Let's see if we can work in some other questions here. There's another good one about thoughts on last mile autonomous distribution. What do you think? I mean, Amazon keeps talking about drones as a solution for some of this last mile distribution. I mean, you talk about there being no infrastructure for where do you land a drone to deliver a package at my house or my apartment building. Do you guys feel, is this a panel that feels like ground vehicles, autonomous ground vehicles are the way package distribution gets done?
Yes.
Is there anybody who'd make a case? Do you make a case for like now when you're planning a new apartment building, you should plan the drone landing pad
The Amazon
somewhere?
landing pad on the top? I guess so, eventually, if that's where it heads. It's the same thing as where's the cutout for the autonomous pickup and drop off.
Yeah. Right.
So yes, the built environment will adjust to whatever that is, but I don't think they'll take the lead on that. I don't think it'll be we'll build it and Amazon will
Right.
come.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there are actually a combination of things, right? So for example, as I said before, typically what happens is that if you want to design these shared mobility systems with autonomous vehicles, you design for the rush hour, and then what it means is that during the off-peak, you have a lot of vehicles that are not being utilized. Now you can use them, for example, for deliveries, right? So you can actually, exploit, leverage this asset that you have to, for that other kind of.
As a matter of fact, there's a startup out in the West Coast called Deliv that's taking the Uber model and applying it to last mile package delivery. And so it's crowdsourcing transportation services to deliver the package.
Yeah.
We'll see how these ideas mature and whether they take off. But that what you said around using a vehicle to deliver the last mile is already happening.
Okay, so maybe segueing from one kind of flying vehicle to the other, when are we going to see flying vehicles like in the Jetsons? And then somebody in the comments said, what's the status on Terrafugia, the local flying car company? As far as I know, they're still up there in Woburn working on delivering the first production vehicle, right, which is a 2-seater plane/car. Wow. They have the pleasure of trying to satisfy not just the FAA, but also the federal highway regulators. And the story that I always love about them is that it wasn't just they were building a flying car, but when they went to the Department of Motor Vehicles, no one had ever tried to register for a manufacturer's plate in Massachusetts for like 100 years, since the early days of automobiles when we had automobile companies. So that was actually the more confusing thing to the RMV was, does anybody know how to issue a manufacturer's plate in Massachusetts?
Yeah. Right.
So what do you think about flying vehicles, and does that fit into any of the vision of autonomy?
I would say why not? I think that, but for me, what bothers me a little bit now is the following, right? So this Amazon Prime Air concept where they send you, your package with the drone. Yeah, it's fine as long as you have one or a dozen of those, right? So, but now starting, imagine that all deliveries, are done with these drones, and you have like a gazillions of drones flying over your head. That will be a little bit of like a long way to come, right? So I don't expect it, anytime soon.
It would
right?
actually work in certain situations.
Right, so for like a rural delivery.
Yeah, I was going to say rural areas or places in the developing world where you don't have roads, great.
Right,
but it feels like I do worry about us all having to put on a helmet in the morning to protect ourselves from I don't want your hardcover book falling on my head.
I think that this is something that today I think that technology is ready to do a demo where the drone takes you. Delivers some object to you, right? But I think we are not really ready for like a scaling up, of that kind of technology.
Yeah, medicines, really light things that, for sure.
Just for the record, if you have a question, wait for the mic, and
if you don't
You've
have
had
the
your
mic,
hand
you
up
don't have
for
a question.
You've had your hand up for a while, so let's take you first.
Thank you. My question to you is, there is a little bit of closed mind in terms of testing these vehicles or this sort of pseudo-hybrid systems. For instance, if we think, let's say, Mass Ave or Route 2, couldn't we just have groups of buses that would move together as though they are a metro system, but on surface? Like it is done, let's say, in some parts of Brazil, in Curitiba, in Porto Alegre. They go in one direction for X number of hours a day, and they reverse as the traffic, let's say, from suburbs into the city in the morning. By 3 o'clock, they reverse. By 4 is from the city to the suburb. And I would say MassAv could be a great element for testing. And for instance, Route 2. And both of them are nightmarish, but probably could work.
Yes.
The answer is yes, absolutely. In fact, there was lots of ideas for this 100 years ago to really ban MassAv to become only that, a BRT system, early BRT systems. The problem is it goes back to this last and first mile problem that people talk about, which is, of course, you may be on the bus, and at the very end of that line, you need to get your bus to your house. And so that distance, whether it's more than a mile, generally it induces people to get into a private automobile. That's generally how people work. If it's beyond, say, 500 meters from where you are, typically you don't take public transit. Part of this is the cost of parking. Right? There's a book called The Free Cost of Parking, or how, which Don Shoup wrote about, which has to do with how parking is subsidized. If you look at parking, generally, even here at MIT, you can ask Emilio about this. Faculty actually pay, parking is actually heavily subsidized. Right? If you pay for parking at MIT, it's about half of the cost of what you would be paying on market rate. If you look at street parking is much cheaper than off-street parking. And that induces people to actually go out and put more money in the meter and not move their vehicle.
Yeah.
So the problem with all of that is the combination of low cost of parking along with the not being able to solve the first and last mile makes it convenient to get into a personal, private, gasoline-powered, single-occupant vehicle. That's what we have today. If it was the other way around, it would be much easier to justify these kind of line transit or even BRT systems that exist in Curitiba and many other places. Now, the interesting thing is if we have particularly shared autonomous technology, then you can imagine changing that paradigm completely. Of course, we're not there yet, and we have to really begin to demonstrate that.
Your example of free or subsidized parking at MIT reminds me of all these valet parking startups that we're now seeing in San Francisco, where the venture capitalists are basically funding very inexpensive valet parking. And one of them was in Boston for a while, and I did notice it changing my behavior, because I think their cap was like $20 for a whole day's parking in downtown Boston. It made it very easy to say, I'm going to get into my car, have Lux valet park it, and not spend the time looking for a garage or even parking in a garage. So just interesting to see the impact of economics on behavior.
And are they out of business now?
Well, they left Boston. And then I think Avis gave them like $200 million in investment. So that's like, that maybe will fuel them to return to Boston.
And that was only the A round.
Give us some more money. Let's take this next question and then maybe another audience question. Isn't this space, autonomous vehicles, already too crowded? It seems like startups left and right are doing this. Is there really space for new startups still? You guys obviously would say yes. I'm not sure on this end.
No more.
No more.
After them, they're the last two that can start up. I mean, I feel like, look, this is a new frontier, right? So you want it to be kind of Wild West. Who knows who's going to win?
Yeah, our experience with real estate tech startups is we're just now starting to see a few of them fail. We're starting to see some acquisitions, but the new ones keep flooding in. That's in a very specific space of tech startups. But I think it's certainly part of the life cycle. What about those that you deal with?
Well, I think that there's still going to be a lot more companies coming into the autonomous vehicle market because the velocity of change and innovation is happening so fast that there's going to be new ideas, new technology, new sensing, new crowdsourcing business models that will be adopted in an increasing number of startups. And I think we'll see, compared to what it is now, I think 10 years from now, with the velocity of innovation, we'll see autonomous vehicles perhaps looking very different. So I think it's part of the kind of the innovation cycle that we're going to see.
I mean, it does interest me that we have seen so many carpooling startups get funded and try to do carpooling in the US. I think in Europe there are a couple that actually have started to gain momentum, and I'm forgetting the name of the one that's kind of blah car in France and other parts of Western Europe. But that's one where I feel like someone eventually is going to solve the hey, I'm driving home to Philadelphia from Cambridge for Thanksgiving, and how do you fill that car? Mike, let's work in your question, and then we'll get back to the pigeonhole questions.
So the built-in assumptions that I think are the most dangerous are the ones that impact all of our decisions. One of the biggest ones is about mass transit. And now, if you talk to anybody, mass transit is assumed to have to be subsidized by the state because they assume it's costly. And they assume automation and the reductions in material costs and everything else can't make mass transit profitable. And I think that is one of the key things that underlies all this stuff, from the use of road vehicles. I also want to point out that's the main thing, is that there's this assumption, and I think that's having these large car companies investing lots of money in autonomous vehicles where that may not be the best solution. And so anyway, just wanted to point that out.
Great. Can we get back to maybe the question of, it kind of came up with your question about Route 2 and the first last mile thing. There's lots of focus on urban options for autonomous and mass transportation, but what about suburban and rural options? I mean, is it a different model, the way you guys think about these maybe 2-seater, 4-seater cars running around cities? Can someone get in one in downtown Boston and say, hey, I need to go to Newburyport? What would prevent you from doing that?
Well, I think that there's lots of focus on city autonomy, but we shouldn't forget about the suburbs. And also, there are lots of communities, particularly in the south of the U.S., where there isn't mass transit, and the only option is actually to get in an automobile. And for the elderly population, they're actually prisoners of their own home. Mm-hmm. So they have to wait for their children to come and pick them up, or they have to subscribe to some kind of service. You have the similar situation here in cities, which is paratransit. Paratransit for anyone that's disabled, you have to call up 24 hours in advance, and you have a 3-hour window for them to pick you up. It's kind of like waiting for the cable guy to pick you up. Mm-hmm. It's really not very effective, and is actually losing a lot of money. So I think that there's a big opportunity space to rethink suburban transportation. That basically they don't have many options. I found out as an anecdote that there is now Uber. Uber is available in the middle of Storrs, Connecticut, next to Yukon. And mm-hmm. there's a guy there that basically has his Uber on. He takes care of his kids, and while he's having breakfast, he sees people, usually a professor, coming down to Yukon to give a talk and move that person around. So we've seen the penetration of these TNCs into those suburban areas starting to happen, but the demand is not as high.
But for you guys, Emilio, is it going to be a different design of vehicle because you're going to want to have range for, Bobby, who I think asked the question, is thinking about like, how do I get to my Berkshire's house or my Cape house on the weekends? Or is it an issue of range that you're not going to have electric vehicles that, can handle the range, or not really?
Okay, so from our point of view, we don't really work on the vehicle, right? So we are actually, drivetrain and like a vehicle agnostic in a sense, right? So that's not really, the specifics of the vehicle design is not something that really impacts us, right? I think that there may be, some of the economics may be different, right? So it's one thing is to serve this like a short range mobility in a city, versus this longer range, like mobility to people in the suburbs. I don't have an answer for you because it depends a lot on the mobility demand, how it changes over space and time. I think that the biggest impact will be, in the like urban, highly densely populated urban areas, but there could be a way to serve also like a less dense areas. And now I actually think that this is where the policy actually comes into play. Usually I don't like these prescriptive, approaches where you say, oh, I don't want cars in this area, right? So I would prefer make it so that people will not find it convenient to use a car in that area, and they will choose some other means of transportation. Now, something that is happening today is that when you think of public transport, for example, commuter trains, things like that, what happens is that people who actually live closer to the city, they're actually subsidizing, those services for the ones who live farther away. The ones who live closer to the city now, they are actually being, why should I take the train if, I only take it for 2 stops? I can take an Uber, right? It will actually cost me less and be more convenient. So what is happening is that a lot of these TNCs, new modes of transportation, are actually taking away some of the customers that actually subsidize, like a commuter kind of like transportation, and make it affordable or require less of a subsidy from the state. So I think that now a big question that needs to be addressed is not whether I require like a fingerprinting for Uber drivers and things like that. Is how do I regulate all these things? How do I regulate autonomous cars? How do I regulate this service in such a way that they work in a very synergistic way with all the other systems and provide fair and equitable mobility to everybody, not only to a certain segment of the public, right? I think that this is really the big question for the authorities, for the regulators.
Well, and it also raises the question of you think about a world where some commuter rail or some subway lines might suddenly be just economically unviable, right? Because there's private market, there's better private market options,
right.
And what do states and countries do with those?
Right, but in a sense, for me, the point of view of the policymakers is, how do I make sure that I set the rules right in such a way that all the players, all the service providers, have in their own best interest to serve the population.
Well, I mean, I think unfortunately when you see regulators do that, often they're just protecting numbers of jobs, right? Because those people are voters. And so you see things like here in Boston where we seem like we're about to say only taxis can pick you up at the airport and at the convention centers. No Uber drivers can pick you up there because we're protecting.
Right. In a sense, that's
constituency.
the wrong. I mean, of course, there is a rationale for that, right? But the thing that really what people must understand is that a lot of these technology are actually shaping or reshaping the way that you can provide mobility to different segments of the population, geographically or with other categories, right? And then how do you fix that in such a way that you align the social objectives with the objectives of the commercial service providers?
Yeah.
Right? So that's a big issue.
You have a question over there. Let's take that one, and then one more of the pigeonhole questions.
Great, thank you so much. Emilio, you mentioned how do you regulate, and I'm wondering what you feel, and Ryan as well, is the role for companies really on the forefront of this technology for fostering the social dialogue that we need to be having about what kind of city do we want to live in, what do we want our built environment to look like. And I'm wondering, do you feel any tension between, you're sort of selling the new technology, but also having to discuss, here are the negatives of what's coming, and here's how we need to deal with, zero occupancy vehicles. So how do you balance both selling your company and promoting
I think that there is
healthy
a
dialogue?
responsibility on on all sides, right? And what I like, for example, in Singapore is that we are in this very tight conversation with the government, right? Where they ask me tough questions, right? Why would you want to do that? What's the benefit, right? And then I need to think hard about all these questions and get back to them with a convincing answer. But I also think that it's very important to it's actually important from our side of technology provider to show what the benefit of this technology could be, right? And do it in a very tangible, convincing way, right? So that the government can feel motivated to support what we are doing, right? And that's why I think that having all of these public trials and pilot deployments is very important. Nowadays you see sometimes you read on the news, people have done a survey and 60% of the people interviewed would not feel comfortable driving autonomous cars. Have they ever sat in one? Have they ever seen how one works, right? And I think that it's important to educate the public and the authorities on what this technology can provide to them. Okay.
Steve, do you want to take a crack at this question too? Feel free to say no.
No.
Okay.
I think I feel very comfortable in talking about the negatives and positives of autonomous vehicles, and also engaging with governments as well as car manufacturers about the quote heaven or hell bookend scenario of autonomous vehicles. Certainly there's a hell scenario, and there's certainly a great heaven scenario. This is what Robin Chase talks a lot about. And somewhere we probably end up in the middle, just given the way the world works. And I also agree with Emilio that the only way you're going to convince people is to build something. You have to build it. You have to demonstrate it. You can't just talk and show videos and give analytics about how much parking you're going to save. You actually have to build something, right? And proof is in the experience itself. But it has to be at the right scale. And I go back to the bike sharing programs. The bike sharing programs started out not working really well. They did a demonstration in Lyon. It went well, and then it went to Paris. It became much bigger. then you had a kind of copycat mentality after that. I mean, everyone wanted their own bike sharing program, right? In a place where, you know, in Paris, people thought if you ride a bike, you're going to get killed. And so I think, again, it's a cliche to say build it and they'll come, but actually that's what you have to do at some scale.
I think Airbnb is instructive because whoever would have thought that you'd let a stranger into your house to sleep in your bedroom for a night, or that I would go stay in the stranger's bed. So there's a group out there, but to your point, Ryan, they need to touch it and feel it and use it. And it's the identifying that opportunity is maybe the challenge of getting the adopters together with the technology and proving it.
I want to get this last question in here because it may require a little explanation from the person who submitted it. Is it just me, or does a sensor-enabled city seem more like a realistic manner to help calm fears of autonomous vehicles and regulations? Why isn't this something we hear more about? What do you mean more realistic manner to calm fears about autonomous vehicles? Is there a person who asked the question willing to identify themselves?
I
you want to take a crack even without
I think I can
explanation?
perhaps guess the rationale. I think the opportunity to embed sensors in an existing city infrastructure is very here. It's quite doable, and the innovation direction of sensors allows the economics to work out well. So you can almost think about you have, you know, back to my talk, perfect information about what's going on in the streets, and if you did have everything you wanted to know about what was going on with autonomous vehicles, maybe safety, continuously updating safety record, where they are, how they're doing. If you had all that insight, would you feel better? And maybe that's what we're getting at, is maybe part of the fear is kind of the unknown about what's going on, and you know, perhaps horror stories. But if there is empirical evidence, even real-time data about what's going on, maybe that would make everything a lot more digestible and real.
I may add something. You know, I totally agree. That's completely true, right? So if you had, you know, your city, you know, with a lot of, you know, embedded sensors everywhere, that would be better. It would make my life much easier. On the other hand, that would be expensive, right? So typically, what we try to do is to be as to limit our reliance on infrastructure being built. Right, so essentially what we need in terms of infrastructure is just the existence of a road, which is typically already there, right?
Right.
And we try to make as few assumptions as possible about the existing infrastructure. If somebody is so nice to, you know, embed sensors and cameras and, you know, other things that we can access, you know, that would be fantastic for us. But we don't want that to be a requirement. If you think of it, there is some history. Was this California Path project on automated highways. This was like 20 years ago, and they demonstrated, you know, platooning and everything was great. But everything, the technology was working on embedded, you know, magnetic sensor in the pavement. So then the governor of California went, saw this beautiful demo. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, so let's do it. How much would it cost it, you know, to put all these sensors on the highways in California? When he heard the answer, say, no, okay, so probably we don't want to do it, right? So. So the answer is yes, but it's expensive, so we don't want to rely on it, right? So if somebody provides the infrastructure for whatever reason, then it's great, we use it, okay?
Didn't we have the same kind of argument years ago when we thought about real-time traffic analysis and understanding where cars are, et cetera? We said, hey, we might have to put sensors everywhere, but now we have Waze, where we have, you can say you have no sensors, you just have people's phone, et cetera. So in a way, isn't that maybe a biased view of yours, just because you're still kind of thinking of that point of maybe we have to deploy too much information, whereas maybe there's already data out there, public data, not necessarily tied to
right. So
every
I don't want to, you know, when we design our system, we don't want to rely on somebody else putting down some expensive infrastructure, right? So we want to be as capital, you know, light as possible. And on the other hand, if there are, you know, there is other infrastructure or other devices that are already there, smartphones, you know, cellular, you know, like towers, you know, things like that, we will definitely use them, right? So we don't want to require new infrastructure to be put in place.
I think the answer to this question is going to be easy, I hope. So let's ask it as the last question. Assuming safety will have to be certified by some sort of body, how's that going to be accomplished? Will there be code reviews, or practical tests? I imagine you might have both, right? Do you want to take a pass at that, Ryan?
Well, Emilio, you can start.
Safety of the vehicle.
Okay, I can. Yeah, I think that this is something that is, it's still unclear. To what level. How the certification will work. Now, in the latest ISO standards, there is something that's called a functional safety, in the sense that if you demonstrate that the thing works, it's kind of okay. But for me, it's very fuzzy. Where the limit is. So it's not clear to me how that will work. Something that you have to realize is that a lot of the companies, or the other companies or other groups that are pursuing this technology, typically what they say, the first thing is safety. Okay, the autonomous car will be much safer than a human-driven car. I'm convinced that will be eventually will be true. I'm not sold on the fact that it is true now. Okay, and actually there was finally somebody wrote it. Somebody did the math and actually wrote an article. It was a report by the RAND Corporation. They showed that in order to prove conclusively that that an autonomous car is safer, that results in fewer fatalities than human-driven cars, you need to drive an autonomous car for 5 billion miles. Now, when Google says that they've driven their car for 1.5 million miles, that's not so impressive, right? So it sounds like a lot, but in terms of statistically proving, the safety is still a long way off.
And also, what is our societal standard of safety going to be for these vehicles? So, I forget if you or Carl mentioned this, but to say autonomous vehicles are going to reduce, car-related fatalities by 15%, that sounds good to me until you still say, hey, there's going to be a lot of... right. There's still going to be a lot of deaths, but so are we going to say 15% is better than 15% reduction is better than nothing, or are we going to say they have to be down to 0, or else we're not letting these things on the road?
I think that is so besides the point. This is one of the hard things that I'm convinced of that disagree with most people. I think that the safety aspect is important, but it's not the main point of this technology. I think that what you have to do is convince people there are so many other very tangible benefits that go beyond safety. But these are things that you can actually measure and appreciate right away, rather than some few percent change in the already low probability that you will involve in a traffic accident. So that is that is very important. I'm not saying that it's not important, but I think it's hard to measure. Okay, and so. On the other hand, there are so many other things that are much more tangible and very, very important. People, people say, okay, so there will be an accident and then the whole industry will die, will collapse. I hope not. But for example, and then they bring, when the Concorde had the accident, then the next day, essentially, the whole program was canceled. No. The Concorde program was canceled because it was not making any economic sense. And the fact that there was an accident was just an excuse to kill it.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So you guys better develop the business model before this first accident. If you want the autonomous vehicle industry to be a success, they got to be cost efficient. I'm getting the sign from Tron that we're out of time, but please help me thank these amazing panelists, and thanks for all the great questions.